introduce the other two assistants. Mackenzie, would you like to say a few words about who you are?
Yes, thank you. My name is Mackenzie Carroll. I am the Legislative Director for Representative Salinas. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. We've already talked to Gordon, and we've got two representatives. Thank you, Senator Wagner. Thank you, Representative Salinas. Representative Salinas, Andrea Salinas, we'll start with you, and you've got 15 minutes to speak about what you wanted to talk to us about today.
Great. Well, thank you all for inviting us here this afternoon. And yes, congratulations to Rachel on winning her race, and to those who are not here. I think we're going to have a strong city council moving forward. I'm excited to be working with all of you, and good to see like everybody who I'm familiar with, and good to meet those who I am not familiar with. So I hope everyone's staying safe. So, and speaking of safety, that's kind of the thing that I have been working on all summer, and it has not stopped, really, is around COVID. So working with OHA on trying to figure out how we respond appropriately, including like what some of these metrics look like. And I'm sure many of you have questions, and I still do too, because some of them just don't make sense to us. And I try to go back and forth and get the rationale. What is the epidemiological impact of this? What is the economic impact of this? What can we expect from health outcomes? And sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And so we're still going around in circles with this. So having said all that, I think a big part of what we're going to be facing kind of coming up in the next 2021 session will be around, because we have these down revenues and we don't have the economy we had expected. A lot of it is going to be about budget. So I serve on the Human Services Subcommittee, which deals with the Oregon Health Plan, our SNAP, WIC, a lot of our human services, housing, that sort of thing. And I think for a big part of it, especially OHP, for the piece that I feel partially responsible for, knowing that I serve as the chair of the House Healthcare Committee. We'll see if the speaker gives me that gavel again next year. I think we're going to have a shortfall in OHP. We did pass Measure 108, which increases the tobacco and puts a new tax on vaping, but we're still going to see a budget shortfall. So we're going to have to figure out how to figure that out. We also passed a Measure 110, which decriminalizes small amounts of possession of drugs, but it also places a new requirement on these new drug treatment and care facilities. And we're going to have to figure out how to fund that. It calls for using the marijuana tax, but there will be, I think, additional funding shifts that we'll have to make in order to make this happen. So I also serve on the Energy and Environment Committee, as well as as chair of the Mental Health Care Committee. So those are some other issues that I think I will be working on, and that I have kind of already started to try to figure out as we move forward. So healthcare really is a big, important piece for me in all of this. The thing that we've been seeing through COVID are some disproportionate impacts on our communities of color. And we have some serious health disparities where we knew we had them prior to COVID, but we've really just pulled back the curtain and magnified these health disparities. So one of the pieces that I will be working on, and that is actually required by law, but we just don't have a lot of hospitals and providers that adhere to the law, which is using healthcare interpreters. We know right now people who are seeking care may not get care in their language, or if they are deaf or hard of hearing, they may not have the interpretation services that they need to get the accurate kind of healthcare. And this leads to medical errors and higher costs for all of us. So this is something, healthcare interpretation, the use of that workforce, and kind of the adherence to that requirement that providers who don't have patients who speak English as a first language get the care that they need. That will be a big bill and a big push for me to make sure that we get that done. We've also been looking at trying to bring down the cost of healthcare. And I think this kind of speaks to everybody in business, your family budget. So we've had a work group or a task force for the last couple of years. This idea has been floated around. It's Maryland had something similar to this, so did Massachusetts, essentially setting a cost growth benchmark to our healthcare system. So whether you're a provider or a payer, an insurance company, it doesn't really matter. We're trying to bring the cost of healthcare down across the board. And so they're looking at potentially, and we have a good group of folks who come from all of these industries. So from the insurance industries, from CCOs, coordinated care organizations, from different provider groups. So whether you're a physician or nurse practitioner, we're trying to figure out whether or not we can bring the cost of healthcare down for Oregonians. Because what we keep doing is adding on, different services, making sure that people have access. But when those costs continue to go up, we know that people don't utilize that care, right? When the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, first came out in 2013, we saw the average second lowest silver tier plan at about just under $300, so about $280. We're seeing it at about $700 right now for the monthly premium for folks on the healthcare exchange. That's really expensive, and that doesn't include the deductibles and the rest of the cost share. And I'm sure as small business owners, folks are seeing this as well. So what one of the big bills that I'm also considering is a public option for the state. And I know there's been a lot of talk about this. You've probably all heard about this at the on the national stage, but I'm actually going to bring a bill forward to do something at the state level, because I've been hearing from small businesses, I've been hearing from individuals that people cannot afford healthcare. And if they do have a plan, it's really hard to access it because their deductibles are so high. So this is something that I will be actually seeking to probably put on the exchange. And the idea is really leveraging the government's purchasing power, so the state's purchasing power, to help the other plans on the exchange. We still have 6 insurers in our healthcare exchange, to compete with them and to hopefully get them along with this kind of benchmark, cost growth benchmark idea, where we're trying to move to a value-based payment system rather than a fee-for-service payment system within the healthcare system. Is there a way that we can get the federal government using its purchasing power to compete with these other plans and then bring the cost of all of them down too? So that is my goal around this, in addition to trying to provide a lower cost plan option with high quality benefits and service for folks who maybe maybe only have 5 people in their small business shop, or maybe you're an individual and you don't have an employer that offers any kind of insurance. So can we get that last 6% of Oregonians who we know are uninsured or underinsured, which is around 280,000 folks that are uninsured, and then there are many more who are underinsured? Is there a plan that we can get to them that could be affordable and accessible with lower premiums and lower cost share? So that is really my goal. And then how we work it out, I'm still very open to details. So please, if this is an interest of yours, I'm happy to hear from you. Mental health is also a big area of concern, and folks may have heard recently, Representative Bynum gave a great interview on OPB, and we've been hearing since COVID and since the outbreak of the coronavirus about how a lot of our BIPOC community really don't have providers of color that they can go to. And, and folks have said to me, whether they're LGBTQ or, have disabilities or are people of color, that it's one thing to go to a physical healthcare provider and see them. Our anatomy is pretty much all the same for the most part, but to talk to somebody, and whether, it's talk therapy or addiction and recovery therapy, it really means a lot to have a shared experience with that mental health provider. And so I think a lot of patients right now are seeking folks who have that shared experience in their licensed care mental health and therapists. So we're going to try to figure out how we expand the workforce around people of color in our BIPOC communities, so that they have access to those kinds of behavioral health care providers. We also just kind of need to expand mental health care and the workforce all across Oregon. As we've been seeing again through COVID, folks don't have access, and our rural communities are really suffering around this. So telehealth has been a great new advent where we've expanded it. The governor was able to get our insurance carriers on board for what we're calling payment parity. So essentially, insurers have been paying the same. So whether you have a visit in person or whether you have a visit over the phone or over video, insurers have been paying the same amount for those visits. And so that has really expanded access for our rural communities and for some of our low-income communities. But we still know we do really have this digital divide and technological barrier where not everybody has access via video. And so we're going to continue to work with insurers, but we will go into this next session, I think, trying to figure this out too, and to create something long-term so that, again, we expand access to care all around. Let me see what else. So we'll also continue to look at ways to bring down the cost of prescription drugs. This has been a big cost driver within our healthcare system. Over the last couple of sessions, we've had a couple of bills that look at pre-authorization for different modes of care. So we'll be bringing that bill back. We got some agreement between the insurers and the medical providers, so physicians don't like, being told, no, you can't have this type of procedure, but at the same time, insurance carriers don't really like being told you have to cover every procedure under the sun. So there's been some agreement there, which is great. We'll also be looking at costs for insulin, so putting a copay cap on what individuals and patients actually have to put out for insulin. We know that the cost of insulin has skyrocketed over the last few years, and it's a drug that has been around since the turn of the 20th century. So there are generic forms of it. It really should not be increasing at the rate it is increasing. Same thing for HIV drugs. We have a lot of HIV therapies out there, and they're really expensive, and there are some generics that are available, but we still see the cost increasing. So we'll be looking at all of that. And I know the Trump administration has basically said that, we're very willing to look at importation of drugs from Canada. I actually had the opportunity last year to talk to some folks from the Canadian consulate when I was in Washington, D.C., and they really kind of put the kibosh on that idea. They said, while it would be a great idea for Americans to be able to, and a lot of times it would be re-importation of those drugs because we have manufacturers here who sell their drugs to Canada, then we'd be re-importing them. But the fact of the matter is Canada doesn't have a big enough market to sell to the US. And so they wouldn't have the supply to sell back to us the drugs that we would need. So I don't think that is going to be a solution, but we have been looking at what it would mean to, again, try to increase our buying power through different consortia. We belong to a few different consortia right now. We have one that we belong to with Washington and a few of the Western states. California is not in that one. We've been trying to figure out how we maybe get into a purchasing pool for buying drugs with California, thinking that we could also lower our prescription drug costs that way, especially through our Medicaid system. And then finally, on my energy and environment work, the one thing that I think we've seen through this last summer is the impact that wildfires have had, again, on our rural communities. And coming at this from kind of a climate perspective and how do we match the two, we've heard, OPB and ProPublica, I think, did some really good work, investigative work on some of the things that we had put into statute over the last years ago, actually, by eliminating the severance tax. And that's on big timber industry that actually can afford to pay a tax that essentially says if you're going to harvest and reap profits from this, you should be putting back into the community. And so we would like to bring this back in order to help pay for some of this wildfire activity, because right now our state, we can't pay for it, and we're trying to help these communities recover, and there isn't a funding stream for this. So I will be working with Senator Golden on the Senate side, as well as Representative Pam Marsh. They're both from Southern Oregon, and then Representative Holby will be leading this, I think, on the House side. He's from the Eugene-Lane County area. And then finally, as someone who was new to leadership and new to my role of trying to help other Democrats get elected, I realized how much money we are all actually pouring into our elections. And so campaign finance reform has been a big, just a big issue for me through all of this. I think we spend a lot of money on campaigns, and I think it actually erodes the confidence of voters the way our system works right now. So with the latest Supreme Court ruling and Measure 107, which passed by, I think it was like a 78% margin, that essentially says, yes, Oregon can move forward and in put in campaign contribution limits. I think we'll be seeing something around that in this next session, which I'm pretty excited about. And I see Senator Wagner nodding his head. So given he's our Senate Majority Leader, that makes me feel good. So I will stop there because I prefer to just take a bunch of questions, and I know there will be a bunch of questions. So I will stop there and kick it over to Senator Wagner. And thank you all again for inviting us.
Thank you, Representative Salinas. That was very good. You made it 15 minutes right to the spot. Thank you. We'll hear now from Senator Wagner for 15 minutes, and then afterwards we'll have a chance to have some questions. Before we turn it over to Senator Wagner, I want to introduce the people that were a little late coming. Nina Carlson, nice to see you. You can say a few words about what kind of business you have, and if you'd like. No.
Hi there. I'm sorry about that. I just had to get to my mute button. Yes, I'm do government affairs for Northwest Natural, and I'm really excited to join your committee. I've heard such lovely things, and already it's been insightful. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Duke Castle, can you say a few words about yourself?
Sure, thanks. I'm part of the Lake Oswego Sustainability Network, and we're members of the chamber, and I'm just glad to be here and hear what our representatives have to say.
Thank you, Duke. And the famous Julia Fowler, would you like to say a few words, Julia?
Good afternoon, Julia Fowler here with Blue Moon Coffee. Hi, Andrea. Thank you for waving at me. I am a small business owner in Lake Oswego and part of the Chamber leadership team. Thanks for having us all today, Casey.
Yes. Okay, Mr. Wagner, Senator Wagner, you're up for 15 minutes from now. I'm very interested to hearing what you want to talk about.
Well, hopefully I won't need all 15, and I appreciate your indulgence with both my attire. I do want you to know that I am hands-free. I'm in a parking lot outside of a Fred Meyer in Scappoose, Oregon right now. I'll explain a little bit why I am where I am, but first, as by way of introduction, I think I have interacted with or know personally everybody on the call, so it's nice to see you, be with you virtually. Huge congratulations to my dear friend, Representative Salinas. I'm so thrilled to have you as my state representative. My wife and I, for folks who don't know, we just celebrated 10 years of wedding bliss, matrimony, and we're introduced to each other by Representative Salinas. It's a story that she is so tired of me telling everyone that that I'm saddled with my amazing life because of my friendship with Andrea. So the reason for the Scappoose trip. So I'm the Senate Majority Leader, which means I get the opportunity with my team to organize the Senate Democrats around the election cycle and then come together around establishing what is our legislative agenda. And we just came through, as you all know, a pretty bruising election cycle, bruising and confusing in some sense, election cycle. And tomorrow we head into 2 days of what we call our leadership retreat. Normally it would be 18 Senate Democrats together at Salishan for 2 or 3 days and talking over issues and selecting who our leadership is going to be, establishing who our candidate is going to be for the Senate presidency, things like that. So of course we're migrating to a Zoom platform, but one thing that I wanted to do in my current position as majority leader is to actually get out and see people to the degree that I could. So I've got my mask and I'm staying physically distant from members, but I'm delivering little treat boxes out to everyone's house. So I spent a day on the road on Monday down to Eugene, and I visited Springfield, Eugene, and Corvallis and Salem. We have a new member coming in from Salem, Deb Patterson. She's going to be an absolutely fantastic addition to our caucus. And today I had my last 2 treat boxes that I was getting out to Senator Riley in Hillsborough and Senator Johnson in Scappoose. So I've got one more stop to go before I retreat. By way of reflection, and I think Gordon might have said this along, I think the high level of heading into this next legislative session has to start with a dialogue about who we are as Oregonians and how we approach our civic life. I think it's, of course, I'm a partisan political official, so just know that. I am a Democrat, I run as a Democrat, I win office and hold as a Democrat. But when we see the conversation that's coming about how do we, in a post-competitive election cycle, come together to be able to govern, whether or not that's at the city level, our county level, our state level, our congressional level, in the presidency, a bedrock faith of democratic principles is so incredibly vital. And you see that being incredibly stretched right now. It turns my stomach as somebody who believes so strongly, coming from a family of educators in civics education, to see people question the integrity of our election system to such a fundamental degree. And unfortunately, you're finding that rhetoric and that mindset is increasingly something that finds its way into electoral life in the state of Oregon. So I think Gordon sent something out maybe to Liz, and if it didn't make it to you all, it's totally fine. But I sent a newsletter out kind of giving my thoughts on where are we kind of post-election, what's going on with Veterans Day, my two grandfathers who served in World War II, and then a newsletter from a colleague of mine named Senator Brian Boquist. And I think it would be really interesting for you who don't live in that service area just to read his take on how he approaches what government is. Because I think it's foundational to when you start watching what the narrative is going to be in the 21 legislative session, just how these world views really do differ. When someone calls the governor a dictator, when they question whether or not our elections have legitimacy, when they question public health, when these kind of repeated sort of things that we see where it's kind of a tearing apart of the norms of how we even relate to each other. We in the Senate are going to work diligently as we put our leadership team together to work across into the chamber and the House to put together a working legislative agenda that reflects the values of the majority of Oregonians. But I also think it's important that we do lead and attempt to lead, because we have majorities, to reach out to folks across the state and from all different political stripes and backgrounds. I would just ask the chamber, and we can spend more time on Q&A rather than having me go on forever in a parking lot, but to leverage your resources, to leverage your skill set, your acumen, your network, to encourage people to engage in civic life again, in civil conversation, but in the fundamental structures that are our democracy. I think chambers can have an incredible sense of value, since people often look to who you are in local communities, and you don't have to take partisan political positions to stand up for our fundamental democracy. And so I know it seems a little bit an aberration for maybe what you were hoping to see from me from my preliminary comments, but if there is a way to leverage your network to really engage statewide in talking about elections and why people coming together, why the governor is not a dictator, these sorts of things, calling people to account. If I'm saying those things, call me to account, but making sure that we're actually being able to have a platform. It's going to be hard enough to talk about important policy differences, let alone when you have people questioning the very legitimacy of elected political life in Oregon. So to downshift from that sort of very high end, my life as the majority leader, assuming that my colleagues will put my name forward again following this weekend, I go from being on 5 committees to being on 1. So I'll chair the Senate Rules Committee, and as Representative Salinas noted, many of the things we'll be working on will be around elections integrity, campaign finance reform. So yes, I, along with Representative Salinas, was a co-sponsor of what became Measure 107, passed overwhelmingly by the electorate. My job is the majority leader, and it seems like an absolutely obscene thing for a position that pays a base wage of $32,000 a year as a citizen legislator. I raised and spent $392,000 this last election cycle, and I did none of that for myself. I didn't do any direct mail. You never, if you were a constituent of mine, you didn't see me putting out any flyers. I wasn't doing any digital ads. I literally was raising money in order to support candidates from across the state of Oregon. So I'm really encouraged that we are going to have a robust exchange and dialogue around where we are with campaign finance reform. Ultimately, until we do get it Citizens United, and it's going to get harder and harder to get at, given the Trump court at the federal level, independent expenditures are going to be a way of life. You know, that's kind of been determined, but I think there are things we can do here in Oregon to try to sort of curb the worst successes of what we see. Anyway, we can talk more. I know Gordon, my political director and district director, is here. In terms of our approach, please do know that we would love to establish this not just as a one-off, but as a regular dialogue. I'd love to have me and Gordon engaged with your thinking as we roll into the next legislative session and have conversations about where we are, whether or not that's in developing revenue conversations or healthcare or education, whatever the issues are. We just want to stay actively engaged with our local chamber as well. So thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Senator. That was very informative, and I appreciate all the work that you're doing for all of us as you drive around the state. And at this point, we've got another 10 or 15 minutes for questions, and so I'm going to turn this back to the group that's here and ask, are there any questions for Representative Salinas or Senator Wagner? Go ahead, Roger.
Thank you. Two questions for Representative Salinas, both related to health care. First, I was surprised to hear that 280,000 Oregonians are uninsured in spite of the fact of ACA. I know that the US Supreme Court approved the tax on individuals who are uninsured, and yet Congress did away with it. There's a better word, but they rescinded the tax. Is that a reason that we have so many uninsured, and what can be done about it? And secondly, what if the Supreme Court does invalidate the ACA in spite of how the pundits are reading the way the oral arguments went? You know, the state of Oregon was unprepared for the unemployment increase from the pandemic. The head elections official, who was just fired, said that Oregon was not really well prepared for the election. What if the ACA is avoided? Is the legislature going to discuss that possibility? Thank you.
Those are excellent questions, Roger. So to your first question, the data shows yes. There was a study out, and it looked at 2016 to 2018. I think it came out last year. Yeah, that's right, 2019. Looking at the zeroing out is what happened. They just took the tax down to 0%. They couldn't eliminate it. But yes, zeroing out of that, what they call the individual mandate, to ensure that everybody has to purchase insurance or some kind of coverage. And because of that, yes, what it showed was that premiums were going to start to go up, and that and I actually put this in one of my bills last session, to include an individual mandate, because the report showed that Oregon's premiums could decrease by about 6 to 8% if we implemented our own individual state mandate, and because a lot of states had. But then once we knew that this was going to come before the Supreme Court, I was like, the state of Oregon is already in lawsuits on around drug transparency and with the drug company. So I was like, I didn't want another kind of healthcare lawsuit out there. So anyway, so we avoided putting our own individual mandate in there. But yeah, you are absolutely right. That is kind of what we are seeing in terms of what the data show. So that is one thing, and that is why. And so every couple of years, Oregon, the Oregon Health Authority also does a survey on kind of who is insured and why are they insured or not. And a big chunk of those remaining, and it is a lot, like 280,000, are folks between the ages of 18 and 34. So young people who think I'm healthy and I don't need that insurance. And then we also have a good chunk of folks who are young workers who we know are working, but are also undocumented. So they just can't afford. So either they can't afford it or they just don't want to pay for it, I think, are the kind of the two driving reasons. And so those are the folks that I'm hoping to get at, and try to make sure that they have a plan that they can afford and that they can purchase. And then we would have to put that layer of making sure that they are required to purchase it, because it does bring the cost of healthcare down for everybody. And then to your second point, yes, this is something that is keeping me up at night. I think, and going back to, so when the Affordable Care Act was implemented by the federal government, Oregon was one of those states that raised our hands and said, yes, we actually want to expand our Medicaid population under this. And so we had about another million people sign up for the Oregon Health Plan that we did not think we would have. So that could be done away with as well. So it is very concerning. I think the governor's office and the Oregon Health Authority is taking a look at kind of, I know, I tried to say it with a straight face, Roger. It's taking a look at what we can do. But I actually, what I've said to OHA is I see a lot of people suddenly without health care, because we don't have a plan in place. That's the truth.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Robert, you have a question?
Yeah, more addressed in the budget shortfall, but a couple years ago we passed the CAT tax that was supposed to finance education and bring $2 billion in to the estate for education. And so has there been any updated forecast on what the tax revenue will be? I understand it's improved from what it was last spring, and what the real shortfall will be, and is the CAT tax still dedicated to education?
So I don't want to jump in, Andrea, if I'm coming in over the top of you here.
Go ahead, either way.
So House Bill 3427, which established the Student Success Act, through the Joint Committee that passed with the funding from the commercial activities tax, funds the three big wings of that program. That money is still dedicated by law to go toward public education, pre-K, especially through an equity lens. So I know that Liz Hartman is on here, my former Lake Oswego School Board colleague, and they're actually budgeting the resources that they've received as notification from the state for this next year to put into to Lake Oswego School District. So the CAT tax money, based on its forecast, is coming to school districts based on that formula, and will continue to come. I haven't seen since the September revenue forecast. I haven't heard anything more. I think, Andrea, we get the next revenue forecast, I think, in early December, and then obviously we get two more during the course of a legislative session. The March and the May forecasts are the ones that really become the bedrock for our estimates for how we structure or leverage our two-year biennial budget. But we obviously saw wild vacillation from May to September. I haven't heard anything about what it might look like in December. Hopefully the federal government will come through with the Biden administration with a stimulus package to help state and local governments with additional shortfall. That would be great. The second thing is the state of Oregon actually for the last decade has done a decent job setting aside reserves we have not tapped yet. So I feel like we'll be able to meet the challenge that we have. And the third is, as it relates to CAT tax specific revenue, we certainly, Robert, would be happy to follow up with you to find out any specific questions that you might have, and where those resources are allocated, or how we're held accountable to make sure those resources that are going to school districts are actually being spent on the things that the school district said they were going to spend those resources on.
And just to follow up, thank you, Senator, on Rob's question. For the 21-23 session, we're still looking at about a $3 to $4 billion shortfall. So we are going, that's why I said it's going to be budget, budget, budget. We are going to have to make some hard choices.
I'm gonna, go ahead, Bill.
Thanks, Casey. I think probably Senator Wagner could take this one. Is that how are we going to be handling redistricting in the state? And I know that you talked at the beginning about who we are, how we come together. 10 years ago, it seems our redistricting went very well. I know that Chris Garrett from Lake Oswego was involved. What are we going to be doing this time around, and what are the underlying principles that you're setting forth for redistricting?
Well, I'd be glad to start, and then I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to talk about the census, because she was integrally engaged in the conversation that's sort of, again, the bedrock for this conversation. So hearkening back 9 years ago, the legislature established joint committees with equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats. And granted, it was the 2011 legislative session when the House was split 30-30 DNR, and the Senate was 16 Democrats and 14 Republicans. So we look a little bit different now with 37 and 18. But be that as it may, those maps passed on a bipartisan, with bipartisan support. I was pretty impressed with what the legislature, I wasn't there, but pretty impressed with what the legislature did at the time. They, I don't remember what the court challenge was to that, but it didn't have to go what's happened historically to the Secretary of State to kind of redraw district boundaries. I don't anticipate that, given the map that we have, I don't anticipate there's going to be that much change, really. I mean, there's been a lot of population growth in Washington County. I think what we can do is establish a robust conversation about communities of interest during the 21 legislative session and see how far we make it with mapping. But if you look at sort of the quote unquote gerrymandered legislative districts that you see across the country, Oregon falls really pretty well into that quadrant of we have representative democracy based on the number of people who vote for a particular political party. So I feel pretty good about our ability to get it done during the legislative session. There is a huge question about timing from census data. And Andrea, not to throw you in under the bus, but do you have anything on the latest on what our timelines are around redistricting?
I wish I did. In fact, the meeting I just finished right before this. So I chaired the Complete Count Committee for the census. I was the co-chair, along with one of the community-based organizations from the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, and then the Communities of Color. So yeah, so we are just wrapping up the Complete Count Committee, which should have been wrapped up in June. It's obviously been extended and then shortened, and I feel really bad. And our partners have included community-based organizations from all over the state, the Census Bureau, PSU's Population Research Center, ACLU. So we've had attorneys looking at all of this and what kind of has gone on with the Trump administration around the census. And like I said, our Census Bureau folks who have been partners with us, I feel really bad because they've been put in a really difficult position. I think, these are public servants who've been working at the Census Bureau for ages, and they recognize that we are being put in a really terrible position. Like Senator Wagner said, we may not get the data that we need fast enough, given our current timeline. So I think between the Secretary of State's office and the legislature, we're going to have to make sure that everything is accurate and complete and ready to go. But we still are not getting clear information from the federal administration at this point. So, but on the good note is that we do have, so going back to kind of how we'll operate, we have built, I think, really good on the ground resources so that community can weigh in on this process. And that's the piece that I feel confident that we will have a robust state conversation around this. So that piece feels good. Our count was so much better even than 10 years ago. Our percentage count was so much better that there is a very good chance that I think we will get that extra congressional seat, which I think we're all, just on pins and needles trying to figure out. But at the same time, we also know that there's some things going on with the federal administration that we may not trust. So it will also depend on where other states end up and land. But Oregon did a very good complete count. It was the first time we had a complete count committee. It was the first time that the state invested its own money. We invested $7.5 million so that we could make sure that we focused in on the hard to count populations, which typically are refugees, kids under 5, those who are disabled, a lot of our BIPOC communities. So we did, I think, a really great job given a time of COVID.
We've got 5 minutes left, and I'd like to ask a question that is part of the Lake Oswego's chamber is for creating equity throughout our organization. And I just finished reading an article about the perception of Oregon in the rest of the nation when it comes to equity. And I have to say that it does appear that we're perceived as a haven for white nationalists, for anti-fascist organizations. And I just want to know, is there any movement towards helping create more equity as well as reining in some of the police work that's happening throughout the state?
So I'll start with that. Thank you for that question. So we have, and it was actually established a few years back. It was before I got to the legislature. We have a bicameral BIPOC caucus. So, and right now we have 9 members. And we will be adding a few more on the House side. We've said it's also nonpartisan. Sadly, Senator Winters was our one Republican who was part of this caucus, and she passed away. So right now it's all Democrats. But we have established a PAC, a political action committee, essentially. And what I have pushed for in our BIPOC caucus is essentially to start to figure out where the two parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, maybe fall short in terms of recruitment and in terms of really trying to build these candidates, right? So that we actually get grassroots folks who are interested in this, but maybe feel like, oh, I need to either be rich or know rich people in order to run. How we can start to build the bench, and again, a bipartisan bench of folks who can run and start to lead in different ways. And I've said everything from school board all the way up to our statewide races. And I know, and this is probably a good question for Willie Poinsett as well. I think so much of it is around changing hearts and minds and culture, right? And that piece of it, and as my good friend, Representative Bynum always says, you can't legislate behavior. Right? That's just something that's really hard. So it does take those hard conversations and really confronting some ugly things. But that's what we're trying to do, at least from the BIPOC community. And I know from the House side, there are certainly some concerted efforts around trying to do some trainings around equity and just making sure that at least our caucus understands some of the lived experience that not everybody has lived.
Well, I'd be interested to see that article. I think that it seems like there was white nationalism and then you mentioned anti-fascism, and I'm trying to understand the intersection between those two different concepts. And so I'd be curious to see what that article says. I know that those words kind of get thrown around quite a bit. I also believe that it should not always have to fall onto our BIPOC community to have to constantly be talking about why diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism public policy making is their responsibility, or why it should be important that we prioritize a decision-making frame that talks about institutionalized racism and diversity and inclusion into everything that we do. And so to the degree that the chamber and other organizations can come together and establish that these are important things. I'm really heartened by looking at Lake Oswego and seeing Masen and Daniel and Neelam, and proud of the role that I've played in terms of going and trying to recruit people who may not see themselves in elected public service, but it's deeper than that. It's also about institutions that traditionally have been established that exclude and understanding your own history in that space. I know the chamber is looking at itself, which is impressive. A lot of chambers around the state don't want to do that work. So to engage in difficult and courageous conversations about race, that's not fun for, you know, a lot of majority white established populations to, you know, sit here and kind of really do and unpack some of that work. But then also the Rotary clubs and everything else. I'm really encouraged, and with Rachel on this call too, the fact that when Respond to Racism and Duke with Lake Oswego Sustainability Network, when the question set was asked of all the different candidates for mayor and for city council, just to see overwhelmingly the support about directing permanent resources and establishing a standing committee around DEI in the city, that would not have happened 4 years ago. I'm glad that it's happening now, but again, I don't think it should necessarily always be about, you know, those with white privilege to step forward and constantly be reminding, you know, being able to come in and out of the conversation. It should be something that is endemic to the work that we're all doing. So I would love to see that article, and I appreciate the fact that the chamber, the local chamber, is really taking this on. It's really important work.
Just so you know, the article's the New Yorker and is from 2 weeks ago, so it was pretty recent. I want to thank everybody for attending. Thank you, Representative Salinas. Thanks, Senator Wagner. I very much appreciate everything that you've talked about today. And we'll spread the word as to what you're working on so that everybody can get a better sense of where we can contribute, because that's what it's going to take, is everybody's got to have to help everybody else. So thanks again. Did I miss anything, Liz?
No, just want to thank the representative and senator. They both live in our community, and so they are probably our closest connection to everything that's going on to government in the state of Oregon. Thank you so much. And there is a recording of this. We will be posting it and sending it out to the membership.
Thank you. Thank you both. And